In the fall of 1878, Willowgate moved like the slow current of the river that skirted its edge. Steady, untroubled, and convinced that the seasons would always turn in their familiar order. Cornfields stretched in perfect lines toward the horizon, their brittle stalks rattling in the wind, and the narrow main street smelled faintly of lamp oil and wood smoke, a scent that made people feel safe because it belonged to ordinary work. Each morning began with the toll of the church bell, its deep, measured tone rolling over the fields and pulling the town together in an invisible thread that felt like reassurance even when it was only rhythm. At its center stood Reverend Thomas Calder, a man of quiet gestures and soft-spoken warmth, who seemed to many the living proof that goodness could wear a human face, the kind of face that calmed a crying child just by looking at them long enough. He moved through the town as though born from its soil, stopping to steady the hand of an old man on a frozen step or to gather a runaway child's mitten from the snow. And people trusted him without thought, folding their doubts away in the certainty that a man so calm, so deliberate in his words, could not possibly carry anything dark inside him. They did not know that for Calder, each nod, each touch, each soft inquiry into a family's health was not an act of kindness but a careful inventory, a running list of weaknesses and frailties that he stored quietly away the way a bookkeeper keeps exact ledgers with no stray marks. In his mind, the town was not a congregation but a living organism, one he had been tending for years, pruning and feeding it in subtle ways, teaching it to lean toward him for light. He studied their routines the way a watchmaker studies the turn of gears, noting who left their lamp burning too late at night, who favored which tea for their cough, whose steps faltered first when frost came early, and each of these details was not noise but signal, not gossip, but design. He saw illness not as tragedy but as an opening, a reminder that bodies could be coaxed into surrender with enough patience and precision, because surrender, when arranged slowly enough, does not look like defeat but like nature. Alone in the rectory after evening prayers had emptied the church, he would sit at his desk and imagine the town laid out before him like a hand-drawn map, each home marked not by its street number but by the vulnerability it contained. And in those quiet hours he did not think of sin or punishment. He thought of sequence, of order, of the right time to touch the smallest thread so the whole cloth would move. The thought of this control did not quicken his pulse. Calder's was not the restless hunger of a common killer. His was the slow, measured appetite of a gardener who knows the harvest will come only if the soil is worked just so, and if the weeds are removed before anyone notices they were there, because a perfect garden is one where the hand that shaped it remains invisible. And so the days passed under the bell's steady voice, each one sinking the town deeper into a trust that would not break until it was far too late, when they would realize that the rhythm they loved so dearly had always been his to conduct, and that their comfort had been the instrument he tuned. The morning air was sharp with frost when the first of the parishioners saw them. Neat rows of raw earth mounded like fresh scars across the churchyard. The soil still damp and dark against the pale grass, the kind of dark that comes from depth rather than rain. 14 in all, each crowned with a wooden marker carved in Reverend Calder's careful hand, the letters clean and exact. The sort of craft people praised because it looked like care. But it was not the workmanship that made the townsfolk stand in a shivering half-circle around the yard. It was the names. Each one belonged to someone still living, people standing among them now, staring at their own names as though they had been written into a verdict that came from no courtroom and allowed no appeal. Beneath the names was a date, precise down to the day, and though the October sun had only just risen, each date lay in the near future, close enough to count on fingers. No one could imagine who had done this or why, but already the silence was pressing, each person measuring the distance between their own name and the day carved below it the way a patient measures the distance between breaths, hoping the count will change if they hold still. Whispers began to pass like a current through the crowd, low and urgent, and though the questions were many, no one dared to touch the markers or disturb the mounds. It felt wrong to interfere, as if the ground itself had been claimed by something that would not forgive intrusion, and in that feeling lay the first small surrender. The belief that the rules had changed and that ordinary hands should not test them. Calder arrived not long after, his breath steady, his eyes fixed not on the graves but on the faces turned toward them, because faces told him what graves could not. He moved between the rows with an air of solemn concern, pausing at each mound as though offering a silent blessing, and the act landed because it was familiar. When he finally spoke, it was to tell them that fear had no place in a house of God, that perhaps this was the cruel jest of some wandering vagrant or the fever dream of a sick mind. He assured them that the Lord's will was not written in soil. Inside, beneath the calm cadence of his voice, he felt the electric hum of their unease settling into place like fine dust. This was not a prank to him. It was the setting of a clock whose hands only he could see, the start of a slow alignment he had been preparing for years. Each name and date had been chosen with the precision of a man tending rare plants. The sequence meant to create ripples, each death softening the town further for the ones to follow, so that by the time they recognized the pattern they would be inside it. He imagined them at home that night, lying awake with the image of their own grave behind their eyes, counting the days without meaning to, feeling a weight they could not name. In their doubt and quiet dread, they would look to him more than ever, and in that trust he would have the control to finish his work exactly as he had planned. He did not need their obedience. He needed their attention, because attention is a door that opens from the inside. Margaret Ewell was known in Willowgate for the steadiness of her hands and the patience of her craft. A woman who could stitch an entire wedding gown by lamplight without once pricking her finger. And in a town like theirs, that meant reliability, and reliability meant safety. But in the weeks after the graves appeared, a shadow seemed to fall across her frame. She grew pale in a way no amount of rest could repair, her breath shorter each morning, her appetite shrinking until even the smell of bread made her turn away, as though food asked a question she could not answer. Neighbors blamed the shock of seeing her own name carved into a headboard of raw pine, yet the truth had begun long before. Calder had been visiting her home under the gentle guise of pastoral concern, bringing small gifts, a jar of honey, a pouch of dried herbs for tea, a folded note with a verse about burden and rest. She accepted them with gratitude, never knowing the honey was mixed with trace amounts of a slow-acting powder that weakened the heart without leaving a mark, never guessing that the herbs contained a rare leaf that thinned her blood just enough to invite faintness without bruises. He altered the flow of her days as if adjusting the gears of a clock, ensuring her work hours grew longer, her rest shorter, her mind softened by exhaustion so that choice would feel like fate. By the first frost, she could no longer climb the stairs without pausing halfway, her pulse fluttering like a trapped bird that had learned not to strike the glass too hard. When her final night came, it arrived without warning. She lay down in her small upstairs bedroom, the faint smell of pine resin still clinging to her from the coffins Calder had blessed in the churchyard days earlier. Sometime before dawn, her heart stilled. Not violently, not with the gasping struggle of illness, but with a quiet compliance, as though it had agreed to his timetable because it had been trained to do so. The doctor came and declared it a failure of the body, a sad inevitability in a woman her age, and no one questioned it, because inevitability is a cloak that keeps you warm even when it is hiding a hand. Calder stood at the foot of her bed longer than necessary, his eyes moving from her still chest to the small clock on the mantel, noting with quiet satisfaction how perfectly the hour aligned with the date carved into her marker. Outside, the ground was already soft from his earlier digging, ready to receive her without delay. And as the first shovelfuls of dirt thudded onto her coffin, he knew the others were now listening harder for the sound of their own hour approaching, whether they admitted it or not, and that listening would make them keep still. On the first Sunday after Margaret Ewell's burial, Reverend Calder's voice carried through the chill air of the church with a weight that felt both comforting and strangely invasive, like a familiar blanket that someone else had folded. His sermons, once rooted in parables of patience and mercy, began to bend in their meaning, sliding gently toward ideas that unsettled without ever naming their danger. He spoke of the body not as a permanent home, but as a temporary vessel, one that could be emptied and prepared for a soul's eventual return. And he did not have to say who would prepare it. He described the ground not as a final resting place, but as a holding room, a place where the faithful might wait until called upon, and the word called settled in the pews like a draft. His words were draped in scripture, yet there were passages no one quite remembered reading before, stitched into a language that hinted at purpose beyond death itself, a purpose that sounded like tidiness. Calder's gaze moved over his congregation with surgical precision, noting who leaned forward, eyes fixed, and who shifted uneasily on the pews, and he filed these reactions next to their ailments, habits, and private fears, because belief travels along the same roads fear does. He knew the ones already softened by grief, the ones who had lost a child or a parent and now clung to any suggestion that there might be a return. A second chapter after the coffin closed. To them, his meaning slid in like a needle under the skin, unnoticed at first, but delivering something that would work slowly in the blood until the body accepted it as its own idea. Outside, the 14 graves lay quiet, untouched, their wooden markers already weathering under the cold. No one dared move them, not after Margaret's death had aligned so perfectly with its marker. The sight of them had become a silent punctuation at the end of each sermon, a wordless reminder that time could be counted in more than seasons. Calder allowed the tension to deepen, knowing the graves would speak more powerfully if left undisturbed, their presence a weight in the mind of every parishioner, their names a list people read with their eyes closed. In their unease, they drew closer to him, seeking reassurance that he never quite gave. Only the promise that when the time came, their passage would be gentle, their vessel well prepared. And in this slow, deliberate shaping of thought, he was not only tending to their faith, he was aligning their minds with the order in which he had already chosen they would leave the world, a cue arranged by a hand they blessed. In the narrow, lamplit study of the rectory, Calder's true work took shape where no hymn could reach it. It was not the labor of sermons or the tending of parish matters that kept him awake long into the night, but the quiet, meticulous construction of methods the Bible had never named, because the Bible does not need to name what a determined man can invent. He sought no satisfaction in crude violence. The body to him was a delicate vessel, and to damage it openly was to ruin the sanctity of his design and admit that power needed proof. Instead, he pursued a science of slow erasure, stripping life away in careful increments so small that even the victim believed the decline to be natural, because the best trap is the one the creature thinks it built. On his desk lay a ledger, not of church accounts but of names, symptoms, and schedules, lines drawn to show when a visit would look kind and when it would look intrusive. He noted which homes could be reached by the narrow crawl spaces beneath their floors, where he had quietly run thin copper piping from the rectory, hidden beneath boards and soil, a hidden lung he could make breathe what he wished. From these, He could release faint vapors distilled from a mix of burning sage, spoiled grains, and a mineral powder imported through a trader who never asked questions because payment answers enough. Inhaling it over weeks wore at the lungs, left the breath shallow, and dulled the skin with a faint gray hue that doctors mistook for age or the weather's toll. And in that mistake was his favorite mercy. No one suffered with a name for it. Beside this was another set of tools, hollow needles attached to lengths of tubing, disguised inside the wooden tips of walking canes or the clasp of a prayer book. With these, he could draw small, nearly invisible measures of blood during visits to the sick, the loss too slight to trigger alarm but enough over time to leave the heart straining against its limits. And a strained heart makes quiet choices. And then there was the matter of food. Calder knew which families relied on the parish for certain staples, and he altered these with the precision of a man tuning an instrument, adding a pinch of powdered resin to the sugar, replacing salt with a form that drained water from the body, exchanging herbal teas with mixtures that bound the stomach in knots. He was patient, always patient, watching for the small signs, the tremor in a hand that was steady the week before, the longer pause on the church steps to catch a breath, the sudden looseness of a wedding ring on thinning fingers. To the town, he was the faithful shepherd, visiting homes with a basket of bread or a jar of jam, his presence a comfort that asked for nothing. To himself, he was the unseen keeper of a precise and sacred order, moving them one by one toward the dates carved in the churchyard, each departure timed so perfectly that even the grieving could not help but feel it had been ordained. And in this Calder believed he was not defying God, but assisting him, ensuring the vessel was emptied without struggle, leaving the soul's path clear and unmarked by violence, a transition so clean that heaven itself might admire the workmanship. And if they admired it, perhaps they would not ask who did it. Samuel Pike had built half the hearths and boundary walls in Willowgate, his hands shaping the town's stone with a patience that made them as much a part of its foundation as the church itself, and men like that are used to thinking that what they build can hold. In his retirement, he lived alone in a modest house at the edge of the fields, his back bent from years of lifting, but his spirit still stubborn, the kind of stubborn that keeps tools oiled even when they are no longer used. He was not the sort of man easily undone by sickness, yet in late November a weakness began to creep through him like water seeping into stone, finding the tiny cracks time always leaves. It started with a dryness in the mouth that no drink could quench, then a heaviness in the limbs, as if the weight of his own bones was pulling him down. A quiet betrayal. When Calder appeared at his door offering prayer and company, Samuel welcomed him without suspicion because suspicion had no place in a house where the pastor sat at your table. The Reverend carried a small satchel filled with herbal remedies and a pitcher of water from the rectory well, claiming its purity was a gift and making the claim sound humble. Samuel drank it gladly, never tasting the faint metallic note beneath. Each visit, Calder made small adjustments to the environment, moving the man's chair closer to the draft that leaked under the back door, replacing his jar of dried peppermint with one laced with a leaf that strained the kidneys, slipping into his tea a dust that sapped his appetite without bitterness. The changes were so slight that Samuel's decline seemed almost invisible day to day, but the Reverend measured it with precision, marking in his ledger the soft tremor in the hands that once split granite, the pause in his breath after crossing the room. Neighbors remarked on the illness with sadness, saying the years had finally caught up to the mason, but Calder knew the truth. The years were only the stage, and he was the stagehand pulling the ropes. By the second week of December, Samuel could no longer leave his bed, his once broad chest sinking in on itself, his skin gray and tight as unpolished stone. Calder prayed over him often, his words gentle but threaded with the suggestion of release, telling him without saying it that the work of his life was done and the time to rest was near. And the suggestion settled because men who build are taught to stop when the work is finished. On the night chosen months before, the house was silent except for the faint drip of the water jug in the corner, and Samuel Pike's breath slowed until it stopped altogether, not from fear, not from pain, but from a tiredness arranged for him. When dawn came, Calder stood by the window watching frost creep across the fields, knowing the grave already dug and the churchyard was waiting. The date on its marker matched the calendar precisely, another piece of the pattern settling into place without a crack. And as the mason's coffin was lowered into the frozen earth, Calder thought of the walls Samuel had built, all still standing, and how easily the man himself had been taken apart, stone by stone, without a single hammer blow, because a structure is strongest at the points you can see. It began with a single cough, sharp and quick, during a hymn that should have risen clean through the rafters, the sort of cough a singer clears with a sip of water. By the next verse, two more voices faltered, their notes catching in throats that felt suddenly raw. Within a week, 6 members of the choir were struggling to sing at all, their voices rasping, each practice ending with a polite but uneasy dismissal and the promise to rest before Sunday. At first they blamed the cold air seeping through the old church walls or the damp that clung to the wood during winter, and these reasons satisfied because they were ordinary. But the truth lay hidden in the narrow cavity behind the choir loft, where Calder had months earlier fixed a row of thin copper tubes along the baseboard, a neat line no one ever looked behind. These were fed from a small, sealed vessel tucked into the shadows of the belfry, its contents a slow-burning mixture he had refined through patient trial. Crushed seeds, ground minerals, and the rendered oil of a plant known to cause the lungs to shed their lining in delicate strands. The vapor it produced was nearly invisible, carrying only the faintest bitter note, easily masked by the beeswax candles he lit before each service, and the candles themselves became part of the disguise, a good smell that hid a bad one. Calder would stand at the pulpit, eyes lowered in devotion, as the choir struggled to keep the melody, their breathing shallow between phrases. He noted who wiped at their lips discreetly, who glanced down to see the fine red thread staining a handkerchief, before folding it quickly out of sight. And each thread was a line he could trace to a date on wood outside. The beauty of the method was its deniability. No fever, no obvious contagion, only a gradual surrender of the voice, as if the music itself was too heavy to bear. And when song becomes heavy, people think they are the problem. In private, Calder thought of it as a kind of sacrifice, a preparation of the vessel through the erosion of song, stripping away the breath until the body understood its own fragility and would not resist when asked to lie down. The congregation prayed for the afflicted, never suspecting that the very air in which they sang had been turned against them, and prayer, too, became a kind of cover because it kept their mouths full of words that were not questions. And as winter deepened, the once bright harmonies of the choir grew thin and uneven, leaving an emptiness in the service that Calder found quietly fitting. A silence where voices had been, another step in the long unseen pattern he was setting into place. The first snow came without warning, a quiet, relentless fall that softened the edges of every stone and fence post in Willowgate, making the world look kinder than it felt. By dawn, the churchyard was a field of white, the rows of graves marked only by the faint rise of the mounds beneath their thin winter shroud, and snow has a way of making edges look gentle that are not gentle at all. Calder stood at the window of the rectory watching the snow settle over the markers like a veil, and felt the same satisfaction a man might feel when the final brushstroke hides the workings beneath a painting. That same morning, 2 more names on his hidden list reached their appointed day. Martha Lyle, a widow who had grown frail in recent years, slipped away in her sleep, her breath simply ceasing as the snow began to fall, and the word simply did a lot of work. Hours later, Thomas Wren, a mill hand with a cough that had deepened for months, collapsed at his workbench and never rose again. Both had been marked long before the graves appeared, their slow undoing attended by Calder's careful hand, a jar of jam that left Martha too weak to climb stairs, a herbal tonic for Thomas that masked exhaustion while starving the blood of its strength. Their deaths were spoken of in hushed tones. Sadness mingled with the chill awareness that the graves in the churchyard now carried more than prophecy, because prophecy is only frightening until it arrives. That night, Calder descended alone into the crawl space beneath the church, lantern in hand. The air was close and heavy with the scent of dust and damp wood. Along one wall, a narrow shelf held glass jars, each sealed with wax, each labeled in his precise handwriting like hymn numbers on a board. From Martha he took a small tooth, loosened from the gums before burial. From Thomas a clipped nail and a thin lock of hair wrapped in linen. These tokens, humble and almost meaningless to anyone else, were to him the truest relics, the anchors that kept a fragment of the person tethered to the place where he kept them. The jars stood in neat rows, the older ones already gathering a faint bloom of clouded glass, as though the contents resisted being shut away, and he liked that resistance because it meant there was still something to keep. Calder believed each preserved piece held a trace of what the vessel had once been, a fragment that, if gathered in the right number and order, might give him a power over the unseen, not for display but for the private liturgy only he could conduct, a liturgy that did not need witnesses to be real. He sealed the jars and placed them carefully back among the others, the line growing longer, the pattern advancing exactly as he had envisioned. Above, the snow muffled the world into silence, and the graves lay undisturbed, waiting under their white covering for the next names to be claimed, and waiting is part of any rite. The belfry of Willowgate Church was a place no one but Calder ever entered, its narrow ladder hidden behind the storage closet where hymnals and candle oil were kept, because the easiest secrets are the ones people are too polite to open. To the congregation, the bell was just another part of the building's heartbeat, its toll marking weddings, funerals, and the turn of the seasons, a sound that could mean joy or sorrow depending on the day. But high above the nave, past the dust and the spiderwebs, the space beneath the bell opened into a small, dim-lit chamber Calder had claimed as his own, and ownership here meant attention. Here the air was still, smelling faintly of iron and old wood, and along one wall stood his most private and obsessive creation, a row of brass lanterns, each one sealed, each containing what he believed to be the last breath of the dead. He had made the vessels himself, soldering their edges with a precision born of patience, fitting them with glass so clear it seemed almost invisible because invisibility was part of the point. Each time one of his chosen died, Calder would be there in the moments after, leaning close with a small, hollow tube to catch the final exhalation before the lungs emptied for good, the way a midwife catches a first cry, and it pleased him that the two movements mirrored. He worked without hurry, pressing the breath into the lantern, sealing it with wax before the air could thin into nothing, and he believed that if he moved with care, the breath would know where to go. Every lantern was tagged with the name of its source, the date of death, and in some cases a single word, a private scripture of his own devising, that hinted at why that breath had been worth keeping, words like patient or obedient or ready. In the quiet of the lantern room he would sit for hours among them, lanterns glowing faintly from the oil lamps within, each flicker a heartbeat stolen from time. Calder believed these breaths were more than air. To him they were the purest distillation of the soul's departure, a moment when the vessel surrendered entirely, leaving behind something both fragile and potent. Holding them gave him a sense of dominion not over the bodies he had emptied but over the order in which they had departed, as if he were both officiant and gatekeeper in a ceremony no one else could see. Sometimes, when the snow muffled the town and the church below was empty, he would light the lanterns in a sequence only he understood, breathing in their faint warmth, convinced that each inhalation drew some of their final essence into himself, and in those moments he felt as calm as water held in a bowl. It was his truest form of worship, a liturgy of control, a prayer in which he was both supplicant and God. And as the rows of lanterns grew, so too did the pattern he had been shaping for years. Each sealed breath a mark in a silent scripture that would not be read until the work was complete, and completion was not a day but a shape only he could see. The 13th grave was smaller than the others, its length just enough for a child, the edges cut clean and deliberate in the cold earth, a neatness that made people look away faster than a mess would. Calder worked alone in the early light, his breath rising in faint clouds as the shovel bit into the frost-hardened soil. And the sound was steady because steady sounds less like harm. This one was for Elias Turner, a boy of 9 whose thin frame and constant cough had already marked him in Calder's mind months earlier, not because Calder despised children but because the pattern needed a small note before the final chord. The child's mother believed his illness was the lingering grip of last winter's pneumonia, but Calder had been tending to it in secret. The subtle exchange of his medicine for hers, the quiet placing of damp cloth beneath the bed to chill the lungs at night, the way a room can be made into weather. Elias's decline had been steady, predictable, the perfect arc to match the date already carved into the small wooden marker. But when Calder set the marker into place at the grave's head, the sight drew more than the usual silent dread from the town. Whispers followed him as he crossed the yard, their voices carrying a new tone, not just fear but the start of suspicion. And suspicion is fear that has found a shape. The change came with the arrival of a traveling physician, a man hired by the next county over to inspect outbreaks of influenza. The kind of man who notices when numbers stand too straight. He came at the request of a concerned uncle visiting for the holidays, and he did what no one else in Willowgate had dared. He studied the death records without assuming they were honest. The physician found patterns that did not belong in a town this size. Too many deaths occurring in the early hours before dawn. Too many patients showing a similar weakening of the pulse and a thinning of the blood. Symptoms progressing with unnatural regularity as if they had been practiced. When he mentioned this over supper at the boarding house, the room went quiet. A few glanced toward the church, though no one spoke Calder's name. By then, the Reverend had heard of the physician's curiosity, but his composure did not falter because composure is a tool. He met the man after service the next morning with the same gentle manner he showed all strangers, offering him the warmth of the rectory and the parish's full records. What the physician did not know was that those records had already been adjusted in the night, times altered, causes of death softened into language no coroner would dispute, and the softening felt like care. Calder's hands never trembled, his gaze never wandered. He listened to the man's concerns as if hearing of them for the first time, and the performance was convincing because it was not a performance to him. Outside, the 13th grave lay open, a pale rectangle in the frozen ground, waiting for the boy whose breath was already thinning to a faint whisper in the dark of his room. The town's unease had begun to sharpen into questions, but Calder knew the work would continue. The pattern was too far along, and suspicion alone could not stop what had been set in motion because suspicion without proof is just another kind of prayer. The storm came in like a living thing, howling down from the north with winds that bent the bare trees and drove snow in blinding sheets through the narrow streets of Willowgate, turning corners into traps. By nightfall on Christmas Eve, the churchyard was buried under drifts taller than the fence posts, the graves themselves swallowed in a white, featureless expanse. The bell in the tower swayed in the wind, its tongue striking only when the gusts hit just right, each hollow note carrying over the frozen fields in a rhythm that had nothing to do with human hands. But as the night deepened, the storm shifted. The wind clawed at the ground, tearing away snow and sending it swirling across the yard in long, twisting veils as if something beneath wanted out. By dawn, the sky had cleared to a pale, brittle blue, and the ground revealed what had been hidden beneath. The mounds were gone. In their place lay 14 open pits, the soil pulled away as if by invisible hands. At the bottom of each was not a coffin, but a single folded sheet, white and unstained despite the churned earth around it. They were laid with a precision that was almost ceremonial, corners aligned, edges smoothed, as though some unseen caretaker had made the beds for occupants that were no longer there, and the neatness itself felt like a threat. The first to see it was the sexton, who staggered back from the sight as though struck. By the time the word spread, the churchyard was crowded with townsfolk, their boots sinking into the softened ground, their voices low and disbelieving. Every name on the markers belonged to someone who had died in the past months. Margaret Ewell, Samuel Pike, Martha Lyle, yet their bodies were gone. The graves, once symbols of finality, had become openings into something far stranger, and the opening made people feel like they might fall. Whispers turned quickly to fear. Some said the storm had unearthed the coffins and the river had taken them, but there were no signs of flooding, no disturbed earth beyond the yard. Others muttered about grave robbers, though no one could explain why thieves would leave behind the jewelry and keepsakes buried with the dead, or why thieves would fold sheets. Calder stood at the edge of the crowd, his coat dusted with snow, his expression one of solemn confusion. He offered theories to match the others, the work of the storm, the cruelty of vandals, but said them with the same calm that had always made people believe him, and belief works best when it is a habit. Inside, however, he felt the quiet satisfaction of a plan unfolding exactly as intended. Each body had been removed in the days after burial, taken not far but not near, placed in a place of keeping only he could reach, and the sheets had been laid deliberately, a marker for the space left behind, a whisper of what had been there, because an empty bed is more unsettling than a missing body. Now the graves were not just a reminder of the dead, they were an unanswered question, a hollow that would grow heavier with each passing day. The physician's suspicions would sharpen, the town's trust would bend and twist under the weight of uncertainty. But Calder had already stepped beyond the reach of their understanding. The bodies were his now, not for desecration but for preservation, their vessels held in a state between stillness and memory, waiting for the moment when they would serve their final purpose. And purpose is what makes horror patient. As the crowd argued in the cold, he turned back toward the church, the sound of the wind fading behind him. The image of the empty graves settling into the minds of the living like a seed waiting for the right season to grow. The search began hesitantly, as if the walls of the church might resist intrusion, as if wood could refuse to remember what it had heard. Snow still clung to the boots of the men who entered, their breath rising in pale clouds as they moved down the center aisle toward the altar. The sheriff, lantern in hand, kept glancing at Calder, who stood off to the side with the patience of a man who already knew what they would find and who did not fear discovery, because discovery would only prove the neatness of his work. It was one of the younger men who first noticed the seam in the floorboards at the altar's base, a thin line of dustless wood that broke the otherwise perfect surface like a mouth pressed shut. A pry bar forced it open with a groan, revealing a square of darkness beneath. The smell that rose from it was not rot, but something heavier. A thick, sweet tang that clung to the tongue, as though the air itself had been steeped in something that had once been living and had decided not to leave. The ladder led down into a narrow chamber carved from the earth, its walls shored up with old beams and lined with shelves that looked like pews turned inward. The lantern light caught on glass first, rows of jars, each sealed with wax, each bearing a strip of parchment with a name and a date written in the same neat hand. Beneath the shelves sat the bodies, not lying in coffins but seated upright in high-backed wooden chairs, their hands folded neatly in their laps as if in prayer, and the sight struck them with a quietness more complete than shouting. The skin was intact, darkened to a deep amber hue, the faces still recognizable beneath the sheen of some hardened resin that seemed to have soaked into them. They did not look dead so much as paused, their eyes closed in an expression of stillness that felt too deliberate to be chance, and deliberation was the most frightening thing in the room. In the dim light, the resin glistened faintly, and the herbal scent in the air hinted at the mixture. Sap boiled with leaves that slowed decay, oils that hardened into a shell, powders that drew the last moisture from the flesh. Each figure was clothed in the garments they had been buried in, but cleaner, as though Calder had washed and dressed them for this final display, an act of care that read as insult. The jars on the shelves above them seemed almost like a catalogue of the lives below. A tooth here, a lock of hair there, a clipped nail, the smallest parts of the person kept separate, each paired with the larger whole. A file you could hold in your hand. The men in the chamber moved in silence, their boots crunching softly on the packed dirt, as if speaking might wake the seated dead and make them turn their heads. Calder remained at the top of the ladder, watching them descend and turn, his expression unreadable. When the sheriff finally looked up at him, the Reverend did not flee or protest. He simply stood, hands clasped, the same way the bodies sat below, as if he had been practicing the posture. In his mind, the work was complete, not an act of cruelty but a preservation, a preparation for something they could not yet understand. And whether that something existed or not did not matter, because belief completes the circle. To them, it was horror. To him, it was order. And in that moment, as they began to climb back up with the weight of what they'd seen, Calder knew the pattern he had tended for so long had reached its appointed end, even if the meaning of it would remain his alone, which was also part of the design. The trial of Reverend Thomas Calder began in the biting cold of January. The courthouse steps slick with frost and crowded with reporters whose notepads trembled more from eagerness than from the wind. Because some kinds of stories make hands shake. Word of the discovery beneath Willowgate Church had traveled far beyond the county, drawing strangers who pressed their faces to the windows for a glimpse of the man who had buried an entire town twice, once in the earth, and once in a secret chamber only he could have conceived. Inside, Calder sat at the defendant's table as though attending a Sunday service, his hands folded neatly, his eyes lowered in calm contemplation, and the posture mattered because it told anyone watching that he felt no conflict with himself. When questioned, he spoke little, and when he did, his words came wrapped in scripture, fragments about vessels and harvests, about the breath returning to its giver, about the folding of garments in the house of the Lord. They were neither direct denials nor confessions, but something in between, a language that hovered just beyond the reach of ordinary meaning, so that anyone listening could find themselves in it if they wanted to. Witnesses recounted his visits to the sick, his quiet alterations to their food and medicine, his habit of standing by their beds at night, and what frightened them most as they spoke was remembering that they had been comforted then. Experts called to the stand could not agree on the nature of his work. Some argued that the herbal resin and preserved tokens were the tools of an old, forgotten ritual, perhaps rooted in superstition or folk belief, a private religion constructed from scraps. Others saw only the precision of a man with deep knowledge of chemistry and anatomy, able to halt decay and weaken the body without leaving the faintest trace of violence, and they used the word method because method lets the mind rest. All agreed on one thing. Every act had been deliberate, the sequence too exact to be the work of chance. And deliberation again was the true crime everyone could feel even if they could not name it. Through it all, Calder remained unshaken, meeting the eyes of his accusers and his defenders with the same stillness, as though he had stepped outside the moment entirely and was observing it for notes. In the gallery, townsfolk shifted uneasily, unable to decide whether they were looking at a madman or a man who had simply followed his faith to a place no one else dared go. And the harder question for them was whether it had been their faith or his that built the stairs. And in that uncertainty lay the most chilling truth. No verdict, no sentence could fully contain what he had done, because the work had been carried out in silence, in patience, and in the trust of those who had never thought to guard themselves against the hand that blessed them, and there is no law for that. When the trial was over and the sentence handed down, the people of Willowgate turned their eyes to the church that had been both their sanctuary and their snare. And the building looked smaller now because knowing is a kind of shrinking. It stood empty for months, the bells silent, the air inside heavy with the memory of what had been found beneath its altar. Eventually the decision came to tear it down piece by piece, until only the bare earth remained, and the dismantling felt like surgery performed after the bleeding had stopped. The timbers were hauled away, the stained glass shattered, the pews burned in quiet bonfires no one celebrated because celebration risks forgiveness. In its place, they planted a garden, not of bright blooms but of low, dark-leafed shrubs and rows of white stones, each one engraved with the name of a victim. Visitors came and left small offerings, a scarf, a button, a scrap of lace, tokens that echoed the intimate pieces Calder had once taken for himself. And the echo was a choice. To keep the small parts where all could see. The state moved quickly to pass new laws, requiring inspections of burial sites, keeping stricter records of the dead, and the papers called these protections, and protections are good even when they are late. But paper and rules could not erase the question that lingered in every conversation. How had they not seen it? How had a man they trusted with their sick, their dying, their dead, been able to weave his work in plain sight without so much as a whisper against him until it was too late? Some blamed the times, others the church's power, but the truth settled heavier and closer. Calder had never needed to hide in shadows. The silence of those around him had been his shelter. He had known their reluctance to speak ill of a man in his position, their fear of seeming suspicious without proof, their habit of folding away doubts until they dissolved, and he had known that kindness could be used like a lid. It was not just his hands that built the chamber beneath the altar.